Hello, everyone. I'm very glad that we're the panel after lunch, not before lunch. So hopefully you've all gotten a shot of coffee and are ready to go. So today's panel is going to focus on AI-powered tools for research, prevention, and moderation. And we've heard a lot about the different perspectives from academics and researchers in terms of the frontier for the usage of these tools. The majority of the discourse that we've heard over the last couple of days has focused on the possible utilization from a malicious perspective, and I'd really love to be able to use this panel to highlight the opportunities that we have here in research prevention and moderation. And I'm slightly biased, but I think I have a phenomenal panel. Joining us today is Dr. Erin Saltman at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. We've got Lewton from IBM, Dr. Florence from Extract, and Lucrezia Bosio. I will not butcher this again, I promise you. But she is joining us from Stop the Traffic. And so we've got a pretty robust representation from cross sectors, which I'm very excited about. To start us off, I'd love for the panelists to give us a quick introduction about themselves, their work, to give us a little bit of insight as to their expertise, and then we'll take it from there with a few questions. Shall we start with Dr. Saltman?
Thanks so much. And really massive thanks to Hedaya for pulling off this multi-day international event. You look across the agenda and we're covering a lot of terrain. I think it's about 57 PhDs worth of information being imparted on us, and it's really fantastic. We're talking about tools specifically, so I could go on and on about a lot of different things that the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, or GIFCT, works on, but really wanted to just focus on the tooling side for a second. So if you don't know us, we're a little bit of a funky cyborg of an NGO. And I say that because we were founded by tech companies, for tech companies, with the mission of preventing terrorist and violent extremist exploitation of digital platforms. So we were made to be a body that could be transparent, that could be a nonprofit, but that could convene tech to work on issues of cross-platform counterterrorism. So not this singular one-to-one counterterrorism or counter-extremism, but also to bring other sectors to the table to talk with tech companies about what they're seeing. Normally it's the case that tech companies are asked to come to somebody else's table and usually reprimanded, and that's okay too. But we wanted a safe space for tech to actually share trends of what they're seeing together and to work with others in a really effective manner. And that was unique because in 2017, when GIFCT was founded, you would literally have tech companies meeting with each other in hallways, in government convenings, being like, well, here's what I'm seeing with ISIS recruitment, but then they jump to your platform, and are you seeing this? Because actually, when we talk about a process of radicalization, it is not just on one platform, one app. And raise your hand if you have just one app on your phone. And terrorists and violent extremists are the same. And so that's all the communication and coordination and combination of everything you're trying to get done in your day-to-day life is across a myriad of platforms. And we do bucket things similarly to governments. What is prevention? What is response to a real-world crisis? What is adaptation and learning? And on the adaptation side, that is really trying to extract lots of information from civil society, from experts, from practitioners, many of you in this room. My GNet colleagues, Belle, I'll have you raise your hand. If you want to write an insight about the creepy topic you are looking at on extremism and technology, find Belle. We literally give microgrants and funds to make sure anyone around the world writing on these little adversarial shifts they are seeing have a platform to disclose what that looks like. And we package these and we give them to tech companies proactively and say, hey, sorry, but you have a problem over here that you might want to look at in Latin America, in Asia, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, America. And so that's been really important. But on the tooling side, the tool that we maintain and run has overlaps with artificial intelligence tools, but is a very straightforward tool that was originally developed to counter child exploitation imagery. And so it's basically a database of perceptual hashes, and a hash is a numerical representation of an original piece of content. And what this means is company A, let's say they find a beheading video, can hash this content. It turns into a numerical value, so it's not source content. They can contribute it to the database with a series of labels that describes the content. So the severity, the ideology, where in our taxonomy it fits, and then all the other member companies subscribing to the database can use it like a fishing net and pull and see if that same piece of content exists on their platforms. So a one-to-one signal can become a scaled-up one-to-many signal. One hash might lead a company to find 100 or 1,000 places where this piece of content was shared. And this raises a lot of questions we can get into in the Q&A, but some are about age-old questions of how you define terrorism, nonetheless terrorist content, how we expand that to violent extremism. So we have very clear buckets that are quite conservative and well-defined of what people can add under what guidance. And there's also questions of feedback loops. Everyone here, even for the most agreed upon group like ISIS, would see foreign terrorist fighter pictures of a dude in the back of a Toyota. Without the context, it's very hard to know that that is terrorist content. That could just look like someone on their way to Coachella. So it's true, and so that's why we need this qualitative information to sit alongside a massive tool that can scale up moderation efforts. And we'll talk about the AI that can sit alongside and things like hasher matcher actioners so that we can go beyond exact hash matching. We can also talk about tools that can be layered with a tool like this, like strategic network disruptions or linguistic processes, or using this to catch things like recidivism. But I'll pause there, leave you wanting more to know about how tools like this operate, usually in collaboration with other tools. And there is no one silver bullet counterterrorism algorithm or tool to rule them all. But when you start doing layered threat detection, you really can scale up proactive efforts in this space.
Dr. Saltman has teased a lot of the Q&A fodder, I think, but I'm going to hand over to the other tech representative on the panel. Philip, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everyone. So I'm Phil Lewton. I'm part of IBM Consulting. For the last couple of years, I've been leading an internal initiative, an internal piece of work where we've been building a platform called Ethics. We decided at the time that was a good name. Since ethics has become a lot more pronounced with Gen AI growing, we've decided it was a bad name, but that's the name we're stuck with. Ethics, we developed it working with some of our clients in the consumer packaged goods industry. It's really around using AI and other emerging technologies such as graph, for example, to help identify possible human rights abuses within commodity supply chains. So things like cocoa, palm oil, soy, for example, and really helping organisations better identify where they have those potential risks within their huge global opaque supply chains, so that they can then spend more of their time focusing on actually managing and addressing these issues rather than spending a lot of time trying to find them as well. So that's our ethics tool, a bit of a summary on that, around that and how it works. We can talk more about that offline if anyone's interested. But it's been a really interesting journey building ethics as well. So there's been a lot of governance. We've had to go through a lot of AI ethics things that we've needed to look at and consider. And also we've had come across a lot of legal implications around data as well, which has been a big obstacle and hurdle, and not something we expected to come across, but something we have come across. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. And Dr. Keane, I'm going to hand over to you as well.
Oh, sorry, one of your slides. I've just got one slide. Yeah, hi, I'm Florence. I'm a program manager at Extract. We are an open source intelligence company. So specifically to this discussion, we'll be thinking a bit about how we look at kind of violent and extremist content. We were actually born out of TGSN. I've got some colleagues in the room from there who are kind of an implementing partner on the ground when it comes to CVE and PCVE, who really identified this problem of this kind of gap in the market with using data to just really better enhance those interventions. I've had a kind of 10-year experience really on the other side of things. So people that knew me before will know me as a kind of researcher who worked in think tanks and academia. So it's really, yeah, kind of strange to be sat now on this tech side of things, really able to kind of see how it worked from the inside and really, yeah, hopefully share some lessons of the cool things we're doing to kind of look at this data. But as pertains to this discussion, thinking about these more ethical questions, and I suppose I'll get into kind of the tools that we use and how we think about ethics, but the key thing, at least from Extract, is thinking about the fact that just because you can't do something with data doesn't always mean that you should. And so despite being an AI and machine learning company, humans remain very much at the heart of what we do. So sitting with our engineers, having domain experts, including me and others, who can actually say, this is the data we should be looking at, this is actually the data we shouldn't be looking at, this is not relevant. That is probably the biggest challenge that we have, making sure our data is accurate, thinking about things like data bias, transparency, and again, all things we can get into the weeds of in the topics. But just because it's AI doesn't kind of discount that real kind of human interaction that we have. I'll probably stop there. I guess it's just to say that this is rapidly evolving. It's very new. I don't think we would claim necessarily that we have the right answer yet. I think it's about, I guess, being humble and like learning from academics and other researchers in the room to understand how they think about AI, how other industries have been talking about it, because we do ultimately have a kind of responsibility to get this right. And just looking forward to getting into the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Keane. Lucrezia?
I'm just going to steal the clicker. Okay, there we go. Hey everyone, I'm Lucrezia. I'm the Data Engagement Manager with Stop the Traffic. And just firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really great to be here with all of you today and with this incredible panel. And Stop the Traffic is a human trafficking prevention organization. And we look at preventing human trafficking through data-led solutions. So just before I get into the tool, the way that we do that is, obviously human trafficking is a terrible crime, but it's also a business. Human trafficking is estimated to be generating $498 billion in annual revenue. And that's just what's estimated, but the data we know is much higher than this because there's a lot that goes unreported. It's a business that can't function without three pillars. That's recruiting vulnerable people, meeting and generating demand, and moving and making money. Without those three things, it can't function. And when we can identify those three things, we can identify trafficking operations and have a chance at disrupting them. And they can be identified through the power of data. So we all know that data essentially is information. And that information lies with frontline workers and those with lived experience. The valuable data that we need is with them. So in 2017, in collaboration with our good friends at IBM, we created this tool. We created a platform for those stories to be shared in a safe, secure, and an anonymous manner. The Traffic Analysis Hub is the world's largest repository of available global information on modern slavery and human trafficking. It contains information on routes, hotspots, groups at risk, and trends. At the moment, we're collaborating with 204 active partner organizations, 500 partners, and we've got about 7 million data items. Essentially, we're continuing to grow, and we basically work with this collaborative network to see what's happening, because you can't stop what you can't see. And this data is then given back to frontline workers. We give it back to frontline workers, those with lived experience, so they can use it in their work. And then we at Stop the Traffic take it to run prevention programs. Essentially, geo-targeted adverts on your phone, working with the algorithm. We can target groups at risk when we've analyzed the data and learned from it, and we can get safety information to those at risk of being exploited, the safety information that they need to potentially prevent exploitation. So we use this tool and the power of data to provide a platform for lived experience to be shared safely, anonymously, and securely, and prevent human trafficking from happening. So it's through collaboration and data sharing that we collectively fight for a world where no one is bought or sold. And I'm going to stop there and hopefully have more questions.
Lucrezia, you set us up for a pretty interesting conversation there. So as you've heard, there's a quite diverse representation of folks across the spectrum of this ecosystem. And to start us off, I'd like to start us thinking about what are the challenges that are involved in building these tools, using these tools, especially because we are still at the cutting edge of developing this for a mass uptake. Up till now, AI has really been used in a niche manner in a sort of consumer way, but the uptake vastly across that wider spectrum is really interesting to see. So I'd open it up to all our panelists to just outline to me what the challenges have been in building or utilizing these tools. Lucrezia, do you want to start us off, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Saltman.
I'll take it away. I guess there's a lot of challenges in the tool, but the main ones that we've kind of been dealing with is, first of all, I mean, we all know this, like, data is really expensive. It's really expensive to develop tools. It's really expensive to keep them up. It's really expensive to train AI models, and we're an NGO at the end of the day. So that was a big challenge, but it's something that, we're really pushing for data, so it's something we're working towards. And then from the other side, the two that we've seen more from the frontline worker lived experience point of view, is trust. Like, to share your experience, to sit in a room full in front of like all of you and tell you what I've been through or what someone's been through is really challenging. A lot of people don't want to retell their story, but it's building that trust to kind of show that through the power of AI, someone can tell their story without having to relive their experience every single day. So it's a lot to go through. It's a lot to kind of, show how data can be used in this other space. And then I guess capacity, the information that we need in our work lies at the front lines, and they're also the most overworked, completely at capacity. And so finding a way to make it easier for people to share their story is what we're dealing with every single day. So those are the main things that I'd say that, from our perspective, has been a bit of a challenge to grow the tool, but we're working towards it.
Yeah, I would say we faced a number of challenges. We now have 35 tech companies that are members that range from the largest like yours or Google or Microsoft to smaller ones like Just Paste It, run by one lovely individual in Poland, or some other non-monetized platforms, really small platforms that have really big issues with terrorism and violent extremism. Not every platform is willing or wants to come to the table on these issues, but the ones that are, they're big and small. So there's an issue of capacity for ingesting new tooling for some companies. There's an issue of a taxonomy of how you have an agreed upon framework for terrorist and violent extremist content. And then there's also this evolution of what we mean when we say content, and then what that means for hashing. And trying to be brief, large versus small companies, I will give you a win as Meta, that it was a really big deal. If you look at countering child exploitation, there are tools called photo and video DNA. They help you match photo and video content through hashing. That is only free to you as a company if you do it for countering child exploitation. It is proprietary and you have to pay for it quite enormous funds worth of money if you want to use it for anything other than countering CSAM. That meant that we actually worked with you to open source your photo and video matching tools, PDNA and TMK, or PDQ and TMK, so that smaller companies on GitHub can now free open source the ability to match photos and videos. So even if you were a small company that didn't have a lot of resource, you could integrate. Meta also helped release its Hasher Matcher Actioner. Horrible name for a tool, fix that.
That's
But
what happens
other
when
than
engineers name
yeah,
things.
engineers should not name products.
I appreciate all the engineers in the room.
But you open sourced it and we were able to give it to tech companies, and it allows for you to do similarity and fuzzy matching. So you don't have to have an exact hash match. If somebody edits a photo, adjusts the color slightly on a video, which we know happens with terrorist content all the time. People love an edit or a crop, and it still allows you to find the content. So that was big in a challenge of large versus small company capacity. On expanding a taxonomy, GiveCT started with a list-based approach of companies agreeing on the UN designated entities list. That's a good start. Like all terrorist lists, there is a post-9/11 Islamist extremist bias. And so if we look at lone actor terrorists from white supremacy or neo-Nazi groups or incel communities, that list will not be sufficient to act quickly. And so we did a lot of work, and I think Hadaya contributed a chapter, and some of you in this room contributed to just questioning how we should expand beyond a list-based approach, and we built out buckets for behavior-based approach of understanding terrorist content. One of those was around our incident response. So when there is a real-world incident with online perpetrator content tied to that, like a live stream, like a manifesto, we can hash that labeled according to the incident. We also have a bucket just around terrorist attacker manifestos and buckets around branded terrorist and violent extremist content. So that was something we had to overcome. And then lastly, just types of content. So even saying attacker manifestos, that's not a photo or a video, that's usually a PDF. And a PDF file is different than a photo or video file. And a URL is a different type of content. And we can name all these, but an audio file is a different type of content. So we actually started building algorithms that could hash not just photo and video, but also hash things like URLs or PDF. And a PDF hash extracts image, but also does text classifiers. How many of you have read terrorist attacker manifestos? We are now trauma bonded. They are often very long, they can be very ranty, there's a lot of copyright issues sometimes, we won't go into it, but often when they're shared in online forums, they might not be shared in all of their hundreds of pages, they might just have some highlight reels. So if you do a PDF hash and it allows for text extraction, it means you can use text analysis to still find when pieces of that might have been shared. So these are 3 different hurdles we had to overcome, and some of those are technical, some of those are definitional, and some of those are just existential, and I think each year we're trying to bring other experts to the table to continue challenging and finding solutions to those questions.
That's, I think, really an excellent segue into the next question that I have, because I do think part of what we're all discussing is an evolution of how the technology is being integrated into all of the different ways in which we're combating terrorism and violent extremism. What Dr. Saltman outlined in terms of the evolution of starting with technology that was the very basis of image and video matching, getting us to a place where hasher, matcher, actioner allows us to action at scale, and now figuring out, okay, we have this insight, how do we then use AI to level that up? And one of the things that I'm really interested in is if we do have all of this data around the syntax and the narrative use of this, can AI be used to pull out strings and narratives there? And I think if you look for this in the upcoming space, GNet and GIFCT are exploring this in a very interesting way. So watch this space is what I'm saying. We've started to touch on interesting aspects of ethics here. And I know the panel and I have been discussing a lot of the obstacles that you face when you start to build these tools. Is not just the technical obstacles, it is the ethical obstacles as well. One of the things that Dr. Keene highlighted is a responsibility towards giving a true assessment of the ethical implications of your tools, both for your users, but also for your staff. Dr. Keene, I'd love for you to outline a little bit of the way that you've taken into account mental health and well-being when it comes to the use of these tools.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a topic that is really important to me for lots of reasons, but I've worked in various guises where certain places haven't necessarily had tools in place to manage kind of looking at terrorist and extremist content, and I kind of as a very young researcher would find myself looking at something that potentially I didn't need to look at and potentially could have had some protection. So of course the general terrorist and extremist space and probably yours as well as connected, there'll be things that we might get exposed to without realizing, and I suppose adding AI to that element, you might be looking at lots of things very quickly and imagery. But there's actually often quite cool things with tech that we can now do and put in place. So talking about at least extract, we have ways of kind of identifying maybe the most specific kind of violence and gore where we can kind of pixelate that. You can also do things like changing imagery into kind of grayscale, turning off the sound, or just kind of reducing images altogether to kind of put in a way of protecting yourself. What's interesting now, kind of working for a tech company, is this mix of people. So we've got researchers like me who've spent a decade in the very strange places of the internet, and so to a certain extent, we might expect to stumble across violence sometimes or a manifesto. But we're actually outnumbered by engineers who come from computer science backgrounds. They may have not really known exactly the kind of images they'd be looking at, and may not also be the people that kind of put their hand up and say, oh, actually, this is a struggle, and I actually might need a bit of a break or a bit of like help with how I process this. So we're really trying to kind of design a policy where we kind of provide space for us to talk about our well-being. We've got kind of external consultants coming in, from psychologists to academics who've worked in this space, but also a kind of layer of contingency that if someone really is struggling and they need one-to-one help, that is something that we can provide, and always kind of thinking about what our responsibility is if people are going to be potentially flooded with imagery, maybe related to some pretty horrific things that are going on in the world, has been really important as we've built the tool.
It's something we've seen as well. So the way our tool operates, we use web scanning, so web scanning, web crawling to identify news reports that contain potential indicators of human rights risks. And in order to do that, to understand what those indicators are, we have to build up data taxonomies of different types of human rights risk. So similar, I guess, to you with building up that taxonomy for terrorism, that's not something where I think you can use Gen AI to create those taxonomies. You need people, researchers, you need data scientists to do that, to understand it and build it up. And we found that the people building up our taxonomies for different types of human rights risks actually we needed to spend more time with them. We needed to restrict the amount of time they were spending doing the research on a daily basis, just because some of the things they were finding were particularly unpleasant as well. So I think it's, yeah, a lot of people talk around Gen AI isn't a replacement for people. I think it's a really good example of how it isn't a replacement for people, but it can potentially turbocharge the exposure the people it supports are exposed to. And it's really important to make sure that you have the controls, processes, and the frameworks in place to protect the people who are covering these sorts of things.
I'm going to hand over to Lucrezia just to give us an additional insight.
Yeah, no, I'd just like to add to that. So we were having a really interesting conversation just before we got up here, and you're always asked, like, what are the risks or what's the ethics around data or data sharing in our case? But we always flip that around and say, like, what are the risks of not sharing or not going ahead with data? Because as Stop the Traffic, I 100% agree that data needs to be regulated. We need to find a way. We need to find a way of looking at it from mental health or different ways to regulate it. By not doing that doesn't mean it's not happening. Like, if we're looking at it in our work, so with traffickers, for example, traffickers use AI and data. They're not doing their work because they're saying, oh, I haven't passed the process. They're sharing. A border is a bit less risky. There's a situation there. They're sharing information. They're picking up a phone. Before it was in one way, now it happens on your phones. And so that is going towards that. So rather than shying away from it, we need to find a way to regulate it and use it for good. There's definitely a lot of ethics around it, but it's trying to, like, turn that conversation around and say, like, okay, what do we need to do? Just, you know, what you were saying, like, when you're researching, you're in the internet, you're not looking at something because of the, like, you come across it. So how can we regulate that to be ethically used? You know, the AI train has left the station. Like, it's everywhere. And so I think, yeah, just to add that.
Yeah, I just on the ethics and human rights side, when we got turned into an independent NGO, we did something that is very normal for tech companies and very abnormal for an NGO, which is we put ourselves through a human rights impact assessment process. That is very painful for a small starting up NGO, but it's because we knew we would be treated more like a tech company than like a normal NGO, because we were working with cross-platform tools and things that could scale up moderation efforts. And so each year we've looked to that human rights impact assessment, and it's meant to be something you work towards different elements of as you grow, as you have capacity. But each year we have a section in our own transparency report. One, just having a transparency report. The section on our hash sharing database has gone from like a few paragraphs to 10 pages in that report each year to talk about what we do with it. We also have a human rights policy for GiftCT as a company. And we have a criteria that if a company wants to join us, not only do they have to have at least an annual transparency report, but they also have to have some form of a human rights statement that's in line with the UN guiding principles. And so actually we've worked with quite a few companies now that have built their own first transparency report or first human rights statement just to be able to join us to help them counter terrorism, which has been quite amazing to see. But we felt very strongly that it had to go hand in hand, because we don't want to give these tools and work with people that might reappropriate them or use them in ways that we didn't expect, that are not actually for what we think of as countering terrorism.
I think that is a really interesting way to look at the possibility of abuse. And I think one of the things that we're all talking about here is there are lessons learned that can be shared jointly. One of the things that, similar to the way that IBM learned their lessons through the experience of using their tools, we've done the same at Meta. You'll notice that we now have systems cards, and they contain a ton of information about the models themselves, why you're seeing what you're seeing, understanding the specifications of the tool. And I think transparency has become one of the go-to terms that you'll hear over and over about these tools, because understanding how they work will really arm you with an understanding of how you can utilize them best. On the sort of in the same tone of what we were just discussing, I'd love to open it up to the panel to deal a little bit more with the question of what are the opportunities for future use? And I think this is a space ripe for the discussion with the audience as well. But I'd love to hear from you where you see opportunities for these tools to further expand their usage.
So there's a couple of areas we've looked at, and before I answer that, one of the big challenges we've had has been data as well, in many different ways. Data bias, how you identify bias, but also data security and privacy, and getting over regulations around that so that we can actually use the information in the news reports that we find. But one of the things we saw Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we use web crawling as a way of finding potential human rights exposures from news reports. The web crawling third party we use, they have a darknet capability as well. And once we've got our thing up and running fully, more established, one of the things we always wanted to look at was start to explore going into the dark web, trying to identify things through there, because it's a dark web for a reason. There's a lot of opaque things happening in there, being able to get access and use Gen AI and other capabilities to identify things within that and feed it back into risk analysts and risk managers is very powerful. So that's definitely an area I see there being potential for in the future.
Yeah, so I think it comes back to the kind of point around ethics of just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. So within Extract, we kind of have a working group which thinks about what kind of trends we might want to look at. And I should say that everything we do kind of strips out personal information. So it's very much kind of that narrative, thematic side of things that we can look at and kind of apply our tools to. I think looking ahead, I mean, even to what some of you have been saying today, thinking about the kind of organised crime side of things, what we might be able to see using our AI tools. For those of you that know me well, my background was in sales for 4 years in the manosphere, so I would be very excited to kind of more so apply our tools looking at that side of things as well. But it's terrorism, extremism, etc. It evolves so quickly, so I think there's any number of things that we may end up working on.
Yeah, kind of tying into what the panel have been saying in the question on ethics is the more we regulate data, the more it kind of grows, the more we can kind of also improve the data that we're working on. So the tool that we have takes its information from 3 different sources: open source, and then NGO, frontline and lived experience narrative, and then also subject matter expert reports. And the more that keeps improving, the more data we're able to scrape, the better it can get. At the moment, our tool is scraping in English. We've managed to get some funding so it can scrape in Spanish, and we just want to keep improving that so we can eventually scrape in all languages, also keep improving the network, grow to more NGOs. We work with NGOs, law enforcement, researchers, and also commercial clients, kind of grow that. And yeah, just work together to kind of drive more impact. So yeah, I think the more that kind of develops and the more we start regulating, the more we can expand. That's where we're looking at going.
I was going to say some of the stuff that is an opportunity for scaling up the use of these tools isn't high tech and isn't sexy, but is really helpful and necessary, like labeling and tags and taxonomy work and getting back in and doing some old school research. Like one of our techies just finished his master's on the side in library sciences, and like bringing back the Dewey Decimal System when we think about large scale inputs of data. I have talked to many researchers, and you might have just a folder in your computer that says Nazi content. I can't ingest that. I don't know what that means. Like that could mean a lot of different stuff. Mm-hmm. Like if I'm gonna hash it and give it to a company, and that's one of the things we want to do is actually see all these researchers that are housing all this horrible content. When it does fit with our taxonomy, what's the best way to find partnerships to ingest it to make sure that that is signal for a tech company to use, so it's not just sitting online, that it actually could be usable. I know the READ database out of ICSR is something we want to integrate with and actually drive researchers. Also not to put homework on all the researchers that don't have all the biggest budgets in the world either, but maybe they can work with the READ database and the READ database will label it for them, and then we can ingest and have others involved in that information flow a little bit better. And I do think there's also opportunities for seeing how to layer these technologies. So hashing plus, so if you have a hash signal, can you use that to build out a strategic network disruption where you map an entire environment of the people sharing that content and remove them all at once instead of whack-a-mole approaches to moderation? Can you use it alongside logo detection? Can you use it alongside counter-narrative deployment? Because if someone has shared a piece of content but they don't violate enough to be kicked off a platform, that's probably a target audience that you want to deploy for a counter-narrative. So using a hard signal to actually get into the gray area of soft hearts and mind approaches, which I think your company and a couple others have already started testing with things like the redirect method and things like beta testing. How much and how frequently would you have to have a counter-narrative, and what would mean that you deserve a counter-narrative? These are all data points that can be used alongside one type of signal leading to other types of responses that are really exciting.
I think to add to just what the panelists have said, there's a there's an interesting opportunity here to utilize these tools to scale up our ability to catch trends at a much wider scale than what we're doing now. But it also brings down the very valuable time of human expertise that's required. One of the things that I think we've heard time and time again is, for example, in terms of what Lucrezia pointed to on the language side, one of the things that Meta has put out is the No Language Left Behind program, which has highlighted over 200 languages that are low resource languages, such as Asturian, Lugandan, Urdu, and those capacities for those 200 plus languages get brought into our ability to then assess at a mass scale the data that we have, which elevates our ability to do this work at a scale unheard of before this. And to add to that, what Dr. Saltman has highlighted in terms of the very manual work of, for example, at my company, at Meta, we've got insights from investigators that have years and years of knowledge around a specific abuse type, either Salafist jihadists or neo-Nazis, and they're able to map out networks of abusers on a platform and black the entire network out. That takes weeks of investigations. It takes weeks of a human sitting down and seeing, oh, this guy friended this guy on this date, and then going back and seeing, well, when was that account opened and how many friends does it have? This can all be highly improved with AI, and adding that human review, but cutting down on that very manual time is very much an opportunity that we're seeing. I'd love to hear from the panel either additional thoughts there, but I would love to deep dive into contextualization and the fact that these tools are going to be able to allow us to be a lot more contextual and a lot more granular in our usage. Open it up.
Language translation is a really good example. So, as I said, we scan websites. We started off scanning English language sites. Then, because of the nature of palm oil, the supply chain, a lot of it is in Southeast Asia, South America. So, started looking at South American Portuguese, South American Spanish, Indonesian Bahasa, starting to look at articles in those languages. It is really quite interesting because there's two ways we could do it. We could either develop our models in those languages and then apply those models on those local language reports, or we could translate those reports into English and then apply our English models to them. Our ideal would be to develop the models in the different languages and then apply them, but that was not something we had capacity or funding to be able to do, because when you're looking at natural language, there's a lot of, it's exactly that. It's the colloquialisms, it's the natural language things that are very difficult to pick up when you're translating things, and especially when you're looking at the palm oil supply chain and you're talking of things like oleochemical plants or things like this. They're not things which naturally pick up very well on translation as well. So that is definitely an area that still needs more work. But again, it emphasises that, yes, Gen AI, yes, technology can help you with these things, but you do need those experts, you do need those people alongside it to make sure that you are heading in the right direction.
And I think there needs to also be an intentionality in building these tools with a diverse infrastructure in mind. And you're going to hear a lot of this as we move forward. And that's why I'm very excited by the model scorecards, basically, that we have, which is you can know from that information, that transparency, what languages was this model fed? What was put into the model in order for it to spit out this result? And I think with an increase in transparency, you'll also see accountability for the diversity of the infrastructure itself going forward, hopefully. Dr. Keane, I'd love to hand over to you.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to be echoing a lot of what you guys were saying. I think that point about the human experts, I mean, like nerds even, like I would see myself as a bit of an incel manosphere geek, which I can just geek out on a certain topic and then bring that expertise into a company. But we're quite a small company, and within that we just have such kind of intelligent kind of people on their very specific niche topic area, and then applying that to our data and talking about tagging as well. You can get so kind of granular and disaggregate so that when you're looking at something, you can just go down so many different layers as to what it is that you're actually looking at, and then being able to trust that that expert has kind of gone through a huge process to really make sure that is accurate, and also changing it and evolving it as terms change, as laws change. And on language as well, we have the models that can translate, but actually, again, having people in-house that speak a really diverse range of languages so that we can really as much as possible, kind of ensure there's kind of linguistically diverse ways in which we're kind of translating our data as well.
Okay, I'm gonna pass over to Lucrezia.
Oh, no, I
Okay.
was nodding. I can also add it later, but you're good.
I'm aware that this group can probably talk to each other for the rest of the day, so I'd love to open it up to a few more questions.